This is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another in-depth deck guide, this time with Grixis or Dimir Death Shadow variants. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative based modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, give us a thumbs up, leave a constructive comment down below, and letting us know what deck you'd like to see next in our deep deck dive. So Death Shadow is a deck that's gone through many permutations in its lifetime. It's a deck that suffered several bans over the course of its lifetime. It once started out as a aggressive base deck with like Monastery Swift Spears, Death Shadows, various other aggressive creatures when the card Gitaxian Probe was legal in the format. In fact, there were several years before people actually found ways to make Death Shadow into a relevant threat. Then people realized that a 1 mana 5/5, 8/8, 9/9, whatever is kind of ridiculous. Started toying around with it. Well, Gitaxian Probe got banned, so there was a more controlling, more mid-range version of the deck that kind of popped up. That mainly featured Death Shadow, Grimag Angler, Street Wraith, threats of that ilk. Usually combined with things like Snapcaster Mage, or whatever other tertiary third threat. It became very similar to a Delver-esque strategy from Legacy, where it had disruption, counter spells, removal spells, played this cheap kind of game, used things like Thought Scour to fill up the graveyard for Grimag Angler, and then got its life total quite quickly low with things like Thoughtseize, Fetch Lands, Shock Lands, Street Wraith, etc. Then Lurrus the Dreamed In was printed. People realized quite quickly that Lurrus is a broken card, and it kind of evolved into the lower to the ground, Jund, Grixis variants that definitely had like Death Shadow, Croxa, that kind of threat. Then eventually Dragon Rage's Chandler and Ragavan were added to the mix, and you kind of had this shell that had Dragon Rage's Chandler, Ragavan, Death Shadow, and then Croxa as kind of your tertiary threats, at least in the Grixis version, which is the primary one we're focusing on here. Then obviously Lurrus got banned. At that point in time, Grixis Shadow had become one of, if not the best deck in the format. It had eclipsed Izzet Murktide as probably the best tempo-ish kind of deck. It's really weird because of the nature of Death Shadow. It makes it hard to play a tempo game. But it would often play DRC, Ragavan, Croxa, get those down early, pressure the opponent, and then close out the game with a large Death Shadow once those initial creatures were dealt with. It's very unique in its strategy because it employs both counter spells and discard spells, and has among the most efficient spells in the modern format. One thing people realized with the banning of Lurrus, or with when Lurrus before it was banned, was that oftentimes it's better to play cheap spells, especially in a format like Modern, that has gotten to the point where there is so many cheap interaction spells. Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, Path to Exile. Basically every color but green has a cheap, efficient answer to other creatures. So Grixis Death Shadow is kind of the epitome of that, and it was doing this kind of even better than a deck like Murktide was doing. While Murktide obviously has the power of Murktide, and it gets to play counter spells and the other things. Grixis was just so more efficient because of Mishra's Bauble with Lurrus. Got to play an even grindier kind of game, and Draw and Lock was kind of a pseudo counter spell for that deck. Obviously, the banning of Lurrus, Grixis Shadow kind of went away for a while. People were still messing with it here and there, but of recent note, it's had finishes here or there. But Murktide has kind of been the undisputed king of Ragavan decks in the modern format. Well, many people have iterated on it, but I believe Canister was the one that kind of finally pushed it into mainstream notoriety again. And while it lost Lurrus, it still maintained the low mana curve that it currently has, and it's picked up a new tool in the form of Ledger Shredder. So one of the problems with this deck is, obviously, a lot of cheap creatures are just very easy to kill with Fatal Push, with Lightning Bolt, etc. So a lot of the threats, Dragon Rage's Chandler, Ragavan, were quite easy to blank because they're ground creatures or they rely on the graveyard. And Death Shadow was kind of your final coup de grace as far as those kind of matchups. You have this weird dynamic where you could play Death Shadow as this like mid-range deck with like Grixis. And Death Shadow honestly could take on just about any role throughout its history, especially once Gitaxian Pro got banned and became more of the mid-range deck. This is a deck that can play a fast Death Shadow, can play a fast Delve creature, end the game quickly, and can also play this kind of like mid-range game, disrupt the combo and other aggro decks, and kind of win this game with this like arbitrarily large creature that they couldn't deal with. But now we're kind of in full circle as to where the deck is now. It picked up obviously Ledger Shredder, which is very powerful in a deck that's playing a bunch of cheap spells. And then you obviously have Ragavan, Dragon Rage's Chandler, and then Death Shadow itself. Death Shadow, a little bit of weird design. It's a 13/13 that gets -X, where X is your life total. So in general, in Magic, you want to keep your life total as reasonably high as possible. Now you use it as a resource, etc. In Death Shadow, you're actively trying to lower your life total, obviously depending upon the matchup, but you're trying to lower it to the point where Death Shadow is a relevant creature. To that end, you play things like Thoughtseize, which obviously is a powerful spell, discards a card from your opponent, but also loses 2 life. You play a bunch of shock lands and fetch lands to lower your life total, and in this version, this deck, you're a little bit more aggressively shocking and fetching to lower your life total. You're not playing any things like any of the various 3-drop lands like Black Cleave Cliffs, etc. to save your life total. You're literally reliant upon fetching and shocking to get your creatures, especially your Death Shadows, up to power. And then, beyond that, you're just playing efficient spells. You're playing Unholy Heat, which obviously turns on Delirium quite easily in this deck, between Dragon Rage's Chandler's ability to Surveil every time you play a non-creature spell, Ledger Shredder conniving every time somebody casts the second spell for the turn, including your opponent. And then, you get to play Ragavan for the early pressure, along with Dragon Rage's Chandler. Dragon Rage's Chandler and Mishra's Wobble, usually quite insane. And then you have your Inquisitions and Thoughtseizes to disrupt your opponent's early draw. And then, as far as the mid to late game, you have this hybrid counterspell / removal spell in Drown and Lock, which is obviously dependent upon your opponent's graveyard size, but in a format like Modern, people are often filling up their graveyard. Beyond that, you have copies of Expressive Iteration, which is banned in Pioneer because of how powerful it is. It's one of the powerful driving forces behind Blue-Red Delver being such a powerful deck in Legacy. And then you have Croxa as kind of another way to pay off having all this stuff you're putting in your graveyard as a way to kind of play transition into a grindy mid-range game. And you're playing things of copies of things like Terminate to deal with things that Unholy Heat can't deal with. So mainly Murktide is what I'd be looking at there. Deck plays a relatively low land count because you have so many different cantrips and ways to see cards. Now, this version doesn't play as many cantrips as the old Grixis Shadow decks before Ledger Shredder did, but you still are playing Mishra's Bauble, Expressive Iteration as ways to see cards in your deck. It's kind of the main deck. Obviously, you have Lightning Bolt here, so you get to play the cheapest removal, the cheapest interaction, and then in the post-board games, you kind of customize what you're doing. So basically, you play this absurdly efficient deck that's just trying to outdo your opponent on mana efficiency and just kind of power them from there. Sideboard, while you did lose Luris, this deck does get to play Gigantha, which is quite nice. Now, obviously, this deck doesn't always want to go to the mid to late game, but Gigantha is an okay payoff for what you're doing. And then, you have different tools. Obviously, Engineered Explosives helps clear out any Urza Saga tokens, pretty good against any of the Hammer Time decks, etc. While you do play a lot of 1-drops yourself, this is still a card you can quite utilize in those matchups. Kolaghan's Command, quite nice for grinding matchups or anything with artifacts. So control decks, Hammer Time, etc. Then you get to play additional counter spells against any type of blue decks or against any type of combo. So you get to pair your Mystical Disputes, Spell Pierces, and Flusterstorms, against the various different Cascade decks, against the regular blue decks. You might bring it in against the against 4-color control, especially Spell Pierce and Mystical Dispute. There's a lot of their things, what they're trying to execute is quite annoying, but it's not always great in those matchups. Dress Down, primarily here for Elementals and Urza Saga tokens. Unlicensed Hearse for any type of graveyard things. This is a newer tool. Its power and toughness is equal to the number of cards you've exiled. So basically you start chipping away at your opponent's graveyard, especially if they're like deck like Living End or anything. Reanimator, is it Murktide, etc. And then you can crew it and make this absurdly large vehicle in the middle of the game, which you shouldn't be short on creatures. Torok, this is a grindier tool, especially that's not reliant upon the graveyard, like DRC or Croxa are. And if you happen to kick it, your opponent randomly discards 2 cards from their hand. And Alpine Moon, kind of a nice catch-all against things like Tron, Cabal Coffers, etc. Anything that really abuses one particular land or one particular land type, you can kind of get them with this. Randomly there are Lotus Field decks out there that Spike's been kind of pushing, kind of these mid-range control decks, etc. This can come in, but mainly this is to shut down annoying things like Tron and such, which can be a little bit, since you're not the fastest of mid-range decks, sometimes you do need that little boost to buy you an extra turn or two against those particular deck styles. This version is a little bit different, but still highlighting a lot of the same cards. One of the main things is that Turok got moved to the main deck. A lot of the other cards are the same, other than this version is running 4 Death Shadow as opposed to 3. I don't know how I feel about running 20 lands. I understand wanting to hit your land drops, but this feels like too many lands for what this deck's trying to do. But, that said, you're still running Ledger Shredders and DRCs. You can easily put those in the graveyard. Still running a lot of the same spells. Your objective is still to get your life total a little bit lower to get a Death Shadow into play. A lot of your games come down to whether you get a Death Shadow into play or not, or in your hand or not. Kind of sculpts how you think. And your life total is usually a fairly decent resource, except for there are certain matchups you have to be cognizant of. Now, decks like Murktide obviously have a little bit of reach with like burn and hasty creatures like Ragavan. The main deck you have to be that this really comes into play is the burn matchup, where it really becomes a thing of, well, I want my Death Shadow big enough that I can kill my opponent quickly, but not quite big enough that they can burn me out. So usually that sweet spot's between like 5 and 8 power is where you usually want your Death Shadows. Sideboard, we're seeing a lot of the same cards. One of the ones that I wanted to highlight in this particular version was Kaito Suzuki. This is kind of an interesting tech. Kind of this mid-range Planeswalker, much like something like the Royal Scions used to be in some of the variants of Death Shadow back before when they had Grimag Anglers and such. It was just a way to grant trample and such. This instead allows you to get a little bit of card advantage, while also being a Planeswalker that can protect itself. And then its ultimate's not terrible for what it does. Another piece of interaction, Nihil Spellbomb along with the Unlicensed Hearses. You have obviously this type of deck. You can play things like Relic or Soul Guide Lantern or any type of graveyard nonsense. This really isn't a deep deck dive in terms of like every single card you can see in these decks, because you see a lot of the same. You see Graveyard Hate, you see interaction. A lot of the cards are the same. It's more highlighting what the decks do specifically. What this deck does differently than Murktide is it has more threats that are not as reliant upon the graveyard. And Death Shadow can hit like a truck. One card that used to see a ton of play in these style of decks when it was before the Lurrus bills and became a grindy Mishra's Bauble Lurrus deck was it used to play Temur Battle Rage as a way to get your Death Shadows past chump blockers. It was a great way to close out the game against combo decks. And really this deck really preys on has really historically preyed on the combo decks because of the combination of discard and counter spells really made it difficult for those decks to win. Now, it's just a really good value mid-range deck that can get overpowered by some decks, but we'll talk about that once we look at the third and final variant of Shadow that I've seen in a while. So this variant is a little bit different in terms of what it's trying to execute, and this is probably more of a mid-range-ish deck than some of what we've looked at before. Plays a lot more spells, a lot less creatures. It's basically running 4 copies of Death Shadow, 4 copies of Murktide, 2 copies of Torak, and then some Void Walkers in the sideboard. This is more akin to what the old Grixis Death Shadow decks were. You had the 4 copies of Street Wraith as cyclers, and then you're just trying to fill your graveyard for a quick Murktide, or you're trying to get a quick Death Shadow into play and kind of leverage from there. This deck used to play a lot more Inquisitions and Thoughtseizes, disrupting your opponent. Fatal Push kind of being your disruptive piece. Now keeping in mind, when Grixis Death Shadow was running Street Race and Gurmag Anglers, this was before Unholy Heat was done, so Fatal Push was kind of the preferred removal spell over Bolt. It was basically Fatal Push and Bolt. Tainted Indulgence hadn't yet been printed, But you were still running Drown the Lock, and you were running cards like Stubborn Denial, etc. This version instead, with a kind of cleaner mana base, is running 4 copies of Counterspell, 4 copies of Archmage's Charm. This deck kind of gets to play this weird Death Shadow Murktide hybrid. I'm not really sure how this one plays out terribly much, just some kind of subtexture, because there isn't as much on this style of deck. But I did play a lot of Grixis Death Shadow when it was the Gurmag Angler build, and this version definitely feels a little bit more like that, where you can play a little bit better of a controlling version than the DRC Ragavan version that exists now. And this is very much a mid-range deck that can play the control role when necessary, can counter your opponent's relevant spells, and just has a ton of counter magic between Counterspell, Drown the Lock, Archmage's Charm. And this is very much a very powerful, interesting version of the deck that I would be interested in piloting at some point, and is a little bit different at what it's executing than some of the other things. Has a 17th land with Seagate Restoration, which notably you have to pay 3 life in order to play it, which works quite nicely with your Death Shadow part of the strategy. As far as the sideboard, this version plays Chalice mainly for hate against the various Cascade decks. Engineered Explosives we've already kind of touched on. Mist will dispute quite nice against the various blue decks. Spell Pierce and Stubborn Denial. And I cannot downplay how powerful having a negate for 1 mana is. And with Murktide and Death Shadow being your primary threats, oftentimes you're going to have a 4-power creature to turn this into a negate. Dauthi Voidwalker, obviously this is an interesting hate piece against the various different graveyard-based decks, whether it be Living End, whether it be any other things. And alternatively, this can be quite a nasty threat if you go turn 2 Voidwalker, turn 3 Thoughtseize your Tron opponent and steal their Karn and go to town. Voidwalker opens up a whole lot of line of plays with Thoughtseize and Inquisition in your deck that could just get quite nasty. Especially if you're able to counter anything irrelevant your opponent does, like say counter their Teferi Time Raveler or their Teferi Hero of Dominarian and steal it. Gets quite nasty overall. And then obviously dress down here for the Urza Saga tokens and elementals of the world. As far as the deck's place in the meta, now, the thing with Shadow is still the most efficient deck in the format. It's more efficient than Murktide. Its threats hit faster. There's more of them. I haven't had a chance to play any of the newer variants, and Shadow is probably of fair decks. Shadow is among the most skill-intensive decks there is, probably even more skill-intensive than Murktide, because you have to manage your life total as much as you do every other resource. Not only are you keeping track of your opponent's hand, your own hand, your counter spells, graveyard sizes, which matter for your DRCs, they matter for your Drown the Locks. The sequencing in the early turns as far as your Mishra's Baubles, your cantrips, your fetch lands, all of that are very intensive. Now, the early turns are the keys for this deck in terms of setting up, pressuring your opponent, disrupting them. It's very much a deck that likes to get ahead, stay ahead, pressure your opponent, much like Murktide. It does it a little bit differently because it has both the discard spells and the counter spells. Obviously, the 2 different variants here that we looked at, the Grixis version is the one you're going to see more of. How do you attack the deck? Now, there are a couple different ways. You can go over the top of it. Decks like Eldrazi Tron has given it fits in the past because of cards like Chalice and reasonable sized creatures. Green Tron has been a close-ish matchup, although Death Shadow could win that matchup with a little bit of help. 4-color Elementals was a deck that was popping up that was answering the Lurrus builds of the thing. It was one of the few decks that could actually keep up with it, which is why when I talked about Lurrus getting banned, I thought Urion should have gotten banned. Turns out, maybe I was a little bit offset about how powerful Urion was going to be in the format. But that's mainly because the Cascade decks have kind of stepped into the void that Death Shadow once filled. Cascade decks were one of the key decks that this style of deck preyed upon, especially Rhinos, just the ability this deck has to pick apart a combo deck like that and kind of close out the game before the Rhinos player can kind of, get beset back up. And this is a deck that very much preys upon combo decks, preys upon decks that rely upon one or two key cards. While a deck like Amulet Titan can beat this with certain draws, this is a deck that preys upon like specific decks that rely on synergistic or particular things to happen, because you take your opponent apart with counter spells, with removal spells, with discard spells. You basically get to hit like all these different angles of attack that really are difficult for those decks to think. Now, one of the things these decks struggle with a little bit is fast graveyard-based decks. Dredge, possibly Reanimator. This is a deck that historically you can attack it on the weird angles, but as far as a conventional battle, this deck is very well set up. It can pick apart the single-piece combo decks, but it can get like outvalued by graveyard-based stuff because of putting so much stuff in the graveyard. There's these kind of things where this is a deck that gives you infinite choices as to especially the early turns. You see probably even more of your deck than Murktide might, but you're also punished more for those decisions. Another deck that tends to attack this deck quite well, especially if the Death Shadow pilot's not familiar with the matchup, are decks like Burn. Decks that can attack on, can take advantage of the fact that this deck is, dwindling its life total. Now that said, a skilled Death Shadow pilot, the Burn matchup becomes reasonable for them, because they know not to put their life total until a dangerous thing, until they can get a point where they can cast a Death Shadow and have some counter magic back up to not die, or their Death Shadow to die. So this is one of the, I would say, outside of the old builds of Amulet Titan, this might be the most skill-intensive deck in Modern. It's a deck I used to excel at about 2 forms ago. So I have quite a bit of the history of Death Shadow. I'm not quite as well versed in the more recent versions of the deck. But overall, this is a very powerful deck that seems to be making a comeback, and the Modern format might get a little bit more balanced as a result. You may not see as many Murktides, you may not see as many Cascade decks. This is a deck that can certainly fight 4-color control on certain axes. Another card that's very reasonable at attacking it is a card like Blood Moon, especially if you can land a quick Blood Moon. This is a deck that is very reliant on its fetch and shock lands, and if it can't get its life total low for Death Shadows, often has problems, as those decks are often quite capable of dealing with the motley crew that is the rest of the creatures other than Kroxa, and Kroxa can be a little bit difficult to cast under a Blood Moon. There's different ways to attack this deck. Blood Moon, tons of removal. You can overkill, especially now that they don't have Luris. You can kind of overload on removal and kill all their things. That's why a deck like 4-color Elementals can be such a difficult, or 4-color Control, 4-color Elementals can be a difficult matchup for this deck if they don't have their fast starts. Burn can be a rough matchup. E-Tron, a little bit of Green Tron, but mainly E-Tron, or decks that have historically given this kind of deck fits. The card Chalice of the Void, with all your 1-drop spells, can be problematic, hence why you see things like Kolaghan's Command in the sideboard. A lot of different decks that can attack this deck, but the main thing is the skill of the pilot makes this deck very skill dependent and can be very taxing mentally if you don't have the reps in with this style of deck. But wanted to get a deck tech out there for you guys. Like I said, this is a deck that I've had familiarity with, especially in the past. It's a deck that I played, trying to think overall on the channel. I played Bird more than anything. Death Shadow is probably up there with Murktide and Is It Phoenix back when Is It Phoenix was a thing before Faithless Looting. In terms of the deck that I probably played the second most overall in terms of online stuff. So like I said, I had quite a bit of familiarity with the deck, and it is very powerful. But, it's not as powerful as it once was. It's taken new forms. Ledger Shredder is given another angle attack with a flying creature that basically does what to a certain extent what DRC also does. So, you know, it gets to filter a lot of things and what it does. It gets to discard things it doesn't like, etc. So, very powerful overall in its execution. Deck that requires a good bit of skill to play. So if you like that kind of style, consider picking up this deck and learning it if you can before buying it. But it's a deck that's making a comeback, and a deck you should probably be aware of in the modern tournaments you may be playing. So, as always, if you like this video content, please consider subscribing to the channel, give us a thumbs up, leave me a comment down below, especially what deck you might like to see next.